October 25th, 1944, off Cape Engaño. The sea was calm. Vice Admiral Ozawa stood on the Zuikaku, the last operational fleet carrier of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On deck, 75 aircraft were preparing to launch. Their mission was to serve as bait, to draw Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. They knew the price would be paid in ships and in lives. To the south, Task Force 38 was already forming its battle line. 15 carriers, 6 battleships, 14 cruisers, and over 50 destroyers. On the mass, radar arrays swept the horizon. In the fire control rooms, Mark 37 directors tracked invisible targets. In the magazines, VT proximity fuses waited to be loaded. And on the decks, Bofor's 40mm guns and 5-inch dual-purpose mounts formed a layered wall of fire. 0844 hours. The first Zero fighters roared down the deck and climbed into the morning sky, straight into an invisible wall of steel. Above them, Hellcats already held the advantage. Below, American carriers closed the formation. From this moment on, courage would meet the system. Zuikaku and what remained of the Imperial Navy were sailing into their final day. The morning of October 25th, 1944, rose over the Philippine Sea in silence. The horizon was washed in pale gold, the sea calm, the wind light. From the bridge of the USS Iowa, radar operators scanned a screen already crowded with echoes. Somewhere beyond the curve of the Earth, another battle was beginning. At that same hour, Vice Admiral Ozawa stood on the bridge of Zuikaku, once the pride of Japan. Her deck still bore scars from Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, battles where she had humiliated the Allies. Now she was the last of her kind, and she had been ordered to die. Ozawa's northern force was a decoy: 4 carriers, 2 hybrid battleships, 2 cruisers, 8 destroyers, all low on aircraft, fuel, and hope. Their mission, to lure Halsey's Third Fleet north, away from Leyte Gulf, so that Kurita's center force could strike the American invasion fleet. Ozawa knew the truth. His ships would not return. Every man aboard Zuikaku knew it too. Below deck, young mechanics fastened bomb racks with trembling hands. Some whispered prayers. Others smiled, not from courage, but from resignation. On the other side of the horizon, Task Force 38 steamed south of Luzon. 15 carriers, 6 battleships, 14 cruisers, and over 50 destroyers. It was the most powerful naval strike force in human history. Fire controlman, first class. Robert Carlson stood inside the Mark 37 director room, a cramped space filled with dials, scopes, and the low hum of gyros. He had been awake since 0500. Coffee gone cold, cigarette untouched. The radar's PPI screen glowed green, and through it, the crew could see the sky. Clusters of light moving like ghosts. Carlson's commanding officer leaned in. Incoming contacts. Bearing 112, range 78 miles. Likely air group. No one panicked. This was what the system was built for. In a matter of seconds, data flowed from the radar into the Mark 1A fire control computer, a room-sized analog brain filled with gears and cams. It calculated target speed, altitude, range, and bearing, even compensating for the Iowa's own pitch and roll. Electrical signals fed the guns automatically. The system was precise, ruthless. It did not think, it only executed. Across the task force, identical systems came to life. On every battleship and cruiser, radar directors locked onto the same incoming trace. The fleet transformed. No longer a collection of ships, but a single, networked organism. Each layer had a role: combat air patrols intercepted at long range. 5-inch guns formed a mid-range barrier. Bofor's 40mm and Oerlikon 20mm filled the close-in zone. It was not chaos, it was choreography, a symphony of mathematics and steel. Aboard the carrier USS Essex, Air Controller Lieutenant Hansen monitored fighter direction. He barked into his headset. Vector 115, Angels 25. Bogies closing fast. On deck, F-6F Hellcats catapulted into the sky. Sleek, armored, powered by 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines. They climbed through sunlight, guided entirely by radar. At 0915 hours, radar plots merged. The first Japanese strike group, 75 aircraft strong, appeared on every screen. Within minutes, the sky above Task Force 38 filled with dark dots, then contrails, then fire. Carlson watched through his scope. One by one, targets disappeared before they even reached gun range. Hellcats engaging, multiple kills confirmed. But the system did not rest. Every calculation continued. Every gun remained, tracking every fuse waited to detonate. To Carlson, it felt mechanical, almost detached. The machine was fighting the war now. He and his crew were simply caretakers of its precision. Lieutenant Commander Masaki Shimakawa, leading a dozen Zero fighters from Zuikaku, never even saw his attackers. At 25,000 feet, the sun glared white across the Pacific. Suddenly, flashes of silver, then lines of tracers. Hellcats dove from above, their .50 caliber fire shattering aluminum. The sky erupted. Shimakawa rolled left, pulled hard, but his aircraft shuddered, engine coughing, wings trembling. He looked back. 4 of his squadron already gone. Below him, torpedo bombers struggled to stay in formation, many already leaking fuel or trailing smoke. "They are everywhere," Shimakawa said over the radio. The sky itself is American. He knew it was hopeless. Still, he led them onward. Inside Iowa's gunnery center, Carlson watched the incoming range shrink. 40 miles, 30, 20. Open fire. The first salvo erupted. 10 twin 5-inch mounts firing in perfect unison, barrels recoiling, shells screaming through the air. At 5,000 feet altitude, the VT proximity fuses activated. Tiny vacuum tubes sensing changes in reflected radio waves. When a target entered the lethal sphere, the shell exploded automatically, filling the sky with fragments of shrapnel. Carlson heard the gun captain shout, "Splash 1! Splash 2!" They couldn't see the enemy, but radar confirmed the kills. Blips vanished. The system had done its work. Aboard the light cruiser, USS San Diego, Gunnery Officer Commander William Harrison watched the horizon through binoculars. Ahead, a Japanese formation tried to press through. He ordered all batteries to fire. The ship shook violently as 5-inch 40mm and 20mm guns thundered. Shell casings clattered across the deck, smoke thick as fog. The Bofors guns, designed in Sweden, built in America, fired 2-pound shells at 120 rounds per minute. The sound was relentless. Pom, 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 pom. A single Japanese dive bomber broke through the chaos, diving toward USS Essex. Harrison held his breath. Shells exploded around the descending plane. At 3,000 feet, flames erupted from its wings. At 2,000, it disintegrated midair. No bomb was released. Harrison lowered his binoculars. "It's not a battle," he muttered. "It's execution." To the east, USS Massachusetts opened fire. Her 10 5-inch twin mounts moved in perfect synchronization. Radar tracking, computers calculating, power drives aligning. Every element functioned as one. Shimakawa, leading the remnants of his squadron, saw the wall of fire ahead. He tried to roll through the gaps, but the sky was alive with invisible explosions. A Zero beside him vanished, just a cloud of aluminum dust. He pressed the trigger. His 20mm cannons spat weak streams of tracers against the armored hull of a battleship. It was like firing into a mountain. He dove lower, desperate, but even as he descended, the air around him shimmered with detonations. Metal fragments tore through his tail and fuel tank. Smoke filled his cockpit. He pulled up, gasping, and for the first time felt not fear, but awe. This is a wall of steel. By late morning, half of Ozawa's air group had been destroyed before reaching visual range. Those who survived faced an impenetrable barrage. From above, American pilots watched as fire and debris streaked across the sea. From below, radar operators watched dots vanish one after another. The Japanese attack never reached the carriers. It simply dissolved in midair. In the afternoon, Task Force 38 turned north. It was their turn to strike. At 1400 hours, American carrier decks came alive. Engines roared, catapults slammed forward, and squadrons of Helldivers and Avengers climbed toward the horizon. Their target, the remains of Ozawa's fleet. Radar guided them in dash. No need for visual sighting, no need for luck. Every bearing, every distance, every course correction fed directly from ships hundreds of miles away. It was no longer a duel between navies. It was a demonstration of systems warfare, the perfection of process. Shimakawa limped back toward his carrier, his Zero riddled with holes, leaking fuel, controls failing. Smoke rose from the horizon, the direction of Zuikaku. When he arrived, he saw American aircraft already diving. Helldivers screamed down in perfect synchrony. Torpedoes streaked through the water. Anti-aircraft guns on the carrier fired wildly, their tracers arcing upward like sparks in the wind. One bomb struck the deck forward and another amidships. Flames raced through the hangars. On the bridge, Admiral Ozawa stood motionless. His last order was quiet. Abandon ship. At 14:14 hours, Zuikaku rolled to port and sank, taking hundreds of men with her. Her ensign, the rising sun, fluttered once, then vanished beneath the waves. When the firing ceased, the sea returned to its stillness. Oil slicks spread across the water, carrying fragments of aircraft, bits of wood, and the bodies of men who had believed in an empire. On USS Iowa, Carlson stepped outside. He had not seen a single Japanese plane with his eyes and only on the radar screen. He stared at the horizon, the faint smell of cordite still in the air. "We didn't fight them," he whispered. "We erased them." By the evening of October 25th, the Northern Force had been annihilated. 4 carriers sunk: Zuikaku, Chitose, Chiyoda, Zuiho. More than 100 aircraft destroyed. Japan's carrier aviation ceased to exist. Tactically, the decoy had worked. Halsey had been drawn away from San Bernardino Strait, leaving Kurita's battleships momentarily unopposed. But strategically, the cost was irreversible. Without carriers, the Imperial Navy no longer controlled the sky. Its surface fleet had become a relic. On the American side, the after-action report celebrated success. Radar efficiency, firing accuracy, coordination. Yet some officers wrote marginal notes. Enemy losses total, but engagement lacked humanity. They had seen how technology could annihilate without confrontation. The enemy had become data, blips on a screen, lines in a logbook. Carlson's diary ended that night with one sentence: "We won because we stopped fighting like men." As darkness fell over the Philippine Sea, the surviving ships of Ozawa's fleet fled north. Behind them, oil fires burned for hours, the sea glowing orange under a silent moon. Task Force 38 steamed south again to support landings at Leyte, to fight new battles that were already waiting. But for those who had seen Cape Engaño, something fundamental had changed. War had shifted from bravery and instinct to calculation and circuitry. The machine had taken command. Night settled over the Philippine Sea. The horizon still burned with drifting fires. For Task Force 38, victory felt weightless. The enemy destroyed, the mission complete. Yet aboard every ship, no one slept. On the USS Iowa, radar screens showed only static. Carlson sat alone, cigarette glowing, the green light washing over his face. He had watched an entire enemy air group vanish, not through binoculars, but as tiny dots that faded from a scope. He wrote one line in his journal: "The sea is quiet, but I don't think it's peace." Far to the north, Admiral Ozawa's surviving destroyers rescued what men they could. Oil slicks burned. Bodies drifted. The air smelled of fuel and salt and ashes. Inside his flagship, the light cruiser Oyodo, Ozawa dictated a message to Tokyo: "Our mission is complete. The enemy has turned north. May Kurita strike." He did not mention that his fleet was gone. At that moment, Kurita's center force was already retreating through San Bernardino Strait, harried by air attacks. The sacrifice of the Northern Force had bought nothing. Ozawa looked out to sea. There was no anger, only acceptance. He whispered, "If the empire dies, it dies with dignity." At 8 a.m. the next morning, Admiral Halsey received confirmation. Ozawa was finished. The Third Fleet had crushed the last Japanese carriers. But messages from Leyte arrived moments later. Desperate pleas from Admiral Kincaid. Enemy battleships engaging escort carriers off Samar. Request immediate assistance. Halsey read the telegram twice. His task force was hundreds of miles away chasing a ghost. Ozawa had succeeded in his final mission, to pull America's heaviest ships out of position. The tactical victory at Cape Engaño was becoming a strategic blunder. Carlson listened as officers argued in the radio room. Orders shifted hour by hour. Turn north, turn south, protect Leyte, strike again. He understood none of it, only that the machine of war had begun to hesitate. Outside, waves hit the hull with a slow rhythm, like a heartbeat fading. For 2 years, Carlson had trusted the system, the radar, the computers, the numbers. Now he realized they could not decide what victory meant. While the fleet rearmed, technicians cleaned the Mark 37 directors and replaced spent VT fuses. Each one cost as much as a college education. Miniature vacuum tubes, copper coils, and chemical detonators machined to microns. Tens of millions had been built, shipped across the Pacific, fired by men who never saw what they killed. In wartime reports, success was measured in ratios: rounds per kill, tonnage destroyed, sorties flown. Nowhere did those numbers mention the faces behind them. At dawn, a destroyer found a life raft floating amid debris. Inside was Lieutenant Commander Masaki Shimakawa, burned, half-conscious, barely alive. When he opened his eyes, the sky was gray. The sun hurt to look at. A corpsman offered him water. Shimakawa asked only one question. "Is Zuikaku safe?" No one answered. He knew the truth anyway. Aboard USS Essex, Lieutenant Hansen watched the recovery of Hellcats returning from the final strike. Their wings folded, their paint charred by cordite. Some pilots never came back. Others landed without speaking, faces hollow. Ground crews scraped the kill marks onto fuselages, red circles with white centers. Dozens by the end of the day. The mechanic painting them paused and said quietly, "We're getting too good at this." By afternoon, Task Force 38 turned south again. Orders from Halsey were simple: strike the retreating center force. But it was already too late. Kurita had withdrawn through San Bernardino Strait, leaving behind wrecks and thousands of dead sailors. Carlson heard the announcement over the intercom. All enemy forces retreating, mission accomplished. But no one cheered. The word accomplished felt wrong. Too cold. Too easy. In Tokyo, the news of Ozawa's defeat arrived hours later. The Admiralty chambers were quiet. A clerk reported 4 carriers lost, no air groups remaining. An elderly admiral removed his cap and set it on the table. "Then we no longer have a navy," he said. Across the room, a young officer whispered, "Then we must fight as spirits." The word he used was shinpu, divine wind. Later, Americans would translate it as kamikaze. As Task Force 38 prepared to support the Leyte landings, engineers aboard every ship analyzed the recent battle. Radar performance, firing solutions, power consumption, communication delays, each variable measured, optimized, perfected. What they did not measure was the psychological effect of absolute superiority. Crews felt disconnected, like operators of a weapon too perfect to fear. Carlson wrote, "We no longer fight people. We fight patterns of light." By late October, the network of radar and fire control covered an entire fleet. Information from one ship fed into others. Destroyers passed ranges to cruisers, cruisers to battleships, battleships to carriers. For the first time in history, a naval task force acted as a single conscious entity, a distributed machine of war. When Hellcats engaged, they did so from radar vectors calculated hundreds of miles away. When guns fired, they did so from data, not sight. The human eye was no longer required. It was a new era, and no one knew what it would do to the soul of warfare. In a makeshift hospital on Luzon, Shimakawa lay under morphine and bandages. Outside, the wind carried the distant drone of American bombers. A nurse whispered that his carrier was gone. He closed his eyes and replied, "Then so is our sky." For him, the war had already ended. He would spend the rest of it training young pilots for missions they would not survive. Aboard USS Franklin, newspapers arrived by airdrop. Headlines read, "Enemy carriers destroyed in North." Sailors cheered briefly, then fell silent. The photographs printed inside showed columns of smoke and blackened sea. No men, no faces. One sailor folded the page and said, "Looks like the end of something." He was right. It was the end of air warfare as they knew it. The victory at Cape Engaño was more than a tactical achievement. It marked the moment when machines proved superior to human instinct. Radar, proximity fuses, analog computers. They had transformed the battlefield into a domain of numbers. War was no longer a contest of courage, but of systems integration. In Tokyo, commanders knew they could not match it. They would instead seek to bypass it entirely, through sacrifice. Carlson was granted one telegram home each month. He wrote to his wife in Iowa, "We're winning fast. Sometimes too fast. Tell Tommy to stay in school. He'll need to understand machines better than I do." He sealed the letter but did not send it. The war felt endless, and so did the distance between man and machine. Reports from Leyte filtered in. Kurita's battleships had sunk several escort carriers, but then turned back under air attack. Among the wrecks was U.S. Gambier Bay, a small ship that had stood alone against giants. The contrast was painful. America's greatest fleet had been decoyed, while its smallest fought the real battle. History would judge the tactics. The men aboard simply called it luck. At sunset, Carlson stood by the railing. The sea was orange, the smoke thin, the wind gentle. Somewhere beneath those waves lay thousands of men he had never seen, destroyed by equations he could recite from memory. He thought of the young pilot in that Zero who had tried to press through the wall of steel. He would never know his name, but he felt connected nonetheless. Two men trapped in the same mechanism on opposite sides of the screen. Night fell again on the Philippine Sea. Radio intelligence intercepted encrypted Japanese transmissions mentioning special attack units. Few paid attention. They had heard rumors before. But within a day, reconnaissance reports from Luzon would confirm it. Small groups of pilots training for one-way missions. The turning point had arrived, but no one yet understood what it meant. Aboard the Iowa, Carlson switched off his radar for the first time in days. The screen went dark, and the room fell silent. He looked out a porthole. The stars were clear. The sea glowed faintly with phosphorescence. Maybe this is what victory looks like, he thought. A sky so quiet you can hear your own doubt. He closed his eyes. In the dark behind them, he saw the same light. The radar scope, spinning forever, searching for targets that no longer existed. The day after, Cape Engaño broke calm and windless. The sea looked polished, but beneath it floated oil, wreckage, and silence. On USS Iowa, Carlson woke to a metallic taste in the air. Smoke, fuel, and sweat baked into steel. The victory reports had come through the night, typed in crisp language. Enemy carrier force annihilated. Objective achieved. Yet no one smiled. The crew moved quietly as if afraid to disturb the ghosts drifting outside the hull. At an improvised airfield carved into red soil, Lieutenant Commander Masaki Shimakawa stood among what remained of Japan's pilots. Around him, mechanics patched holes in Zero fighters with sheets of tin. Engines coughed black smoke. The air stank of gasoline. A young officer read aloud, "Those who wish to offer their lives for the Emperor, step forward." Shimakawa stepped forward with the rest. Not from faith, from emptiness. Cape Engaño had shown him that Japan could no longer win by skill. All that remained was to die convincingly. Far to the east, Task Force 38 moved south again. Ships glistened under the noon sun, decks scrubbed clean of soot. To any observer, it looked invincible. Inside, every man waited for the next alarm. Radar operators scanned low to the west. The echoes were faint, erratic. Something small, flying barely above the waves. Lieutenant Hansen's voice crackled across the intercom. Multiple bogies inbound, low altitude. No one yet knew this was a new kind of attack. Before takeoff, a chaplain bowed to the gathered pilots. He handed each a white headband painted with the red sun and a small vial of sake. "Fly with honor. Become the thunder." Shimakawa tied the band around his head. He felt no thunder, only exhaustion. A mechanic whispered, "Come back safe." They both knew that was impossible. At 1100 hours, the first Kamikaze squadron rolled down the dirt runway. Zeros, each carrying a single 250-kilogram bomb. Their orders were simple. Find the enemy. Do not return. On USS Stanley, a destroyer at the edge of the formation, radar picked up 3 fast contacts approaching at wavetop height. Range 12 miles. At first, operators thought they were reconnaissance planes. Then one climbed sharply. "Open fire!" 5-inch guns barked. Two aircraft exploded almost instantly. The third kept coming. Lookouts shouted. The plane was diving straight for USS St. Lo, a small escort carrier. Seconds later, a white flash tore through the sky. And now, the impact punched through the flight deck into the hangar. A fuel line ruptured. Explosions rippled down the spine of the ship. Within 7 minutes, St. Lo rolled over and sank. 142 men died. The first kamikaze strike in history had succeeded. On the carrier USS Franklin, gunner's mate Parker manned his station as alarms blared. Fire in the hangar. Maintain control. Heat roared through the decks. Smoke blinded him. He could hear the guns above. 40-millimeter Bofors thundering, shells clattering like rain on steel. Every surface shook. Men coughed, shouted, vanished into the haze. Parker later wrote, "It wasn't battle, it was the inside of a furnace." At 1500 hours, radar screens again filled with faint returns. More planes flying even lower. Hellcats scrambled, but some targets slipped beneath detection. A Zero burst from the haze and slammed into USS Below Wood. Another struck USS Sante, igniting aviation fuel. A third dove into USS Suwannee, scattering flaming debris across her deck. Within 1 hour, 5 carriers were burning. Steel bent. Men screamed. The air itself caught fire. His compass flickered, fuel low. Below, endless water. Shimakawa spotted smoke on the horizon. Gray columns against the sun. American ships. He leveled out at 50 feet. The wind roared in his ears. His left arm trembled on the throttle. "For Zuikaku," he whispered. He opened the dive brakes and aimed for the largest silhouette ahead. A carrier, maybe Essex, maybe Lexington. He could not tell. He did not care. Carlson sat in the Combat Information Center, listening to fragmented radio calls. Kamikaze hit forward deck. Fire in hangar. Multiple casualties. He traced the blips on his scope. Each one moved faster than expected. Straight, unwavering. Then one vanished, then another. The system registered loss of signal. But Carlson knew what it meant. "They're not missing," he muttered. "They're crashing." For the first time, radar could not explain what it saw. Shimakawa's plane tore through flak bursts. Shrapnel ripped his wings. Smoke filled the cockpit. He pressed the trigger. Guns clicked empty. At 2,000 feet, he felt the world narrow to a single point, the carrier's deck rushing upward. He shouted into the radio, "For those who died before me, this is the end." A white flash. Sound vanished. Aboard USS Essex, the explosion ripped open the forward elevator. Men were thrown into the air. Fire spread through the hangar. Damage control teams raced with hoses and foam, choking on smoke. No one ever found the pilot. By sunset, the task force fought not an enemy formation, but the sky itself. Every direction seemed to carry a threat. Hellcats darted among black columns of smoke, gunners firing until barrels glowed. Carlson emerged from the CIC to see the horizon glowing orange. Ships burned but held formation. The fleet refused to scatter, a mechanical reflex stronger than fear. He realized the truth. The U.S. Navy had built a perfect defensive machine, but now that machine was trapped inside its own logic, unable to comprehend an enemy who sought death, not survival. At Makanahara Airfield, night fell. Only one plane returned, its pilot unconscious, missing a leg. Officers gathered around him. Someone asked, "Did you hit?" The man nodded weakly, then died. A staff officer recorded, "Mission success, 80%. 26 pilots achieved glorious death." He did not write their names. There was no space for them. When dawn came, the fires still burned. Santee limped south, her deck a twisted maze of holes. Franklin's hangar smelled of burnt paint and flesh. Sailors scraped melted aluminum from the steel. The ocean was littered with fragments. Wings, helmets, life jackets. Birds circled, hesitant to land. Admiral Sherman's official report read, "We have encountered an enemy that fights beyond logic. Existing defense measures inadequate against deliberate collision tactics. In the mess hall, silence, no jokes, no music. Even victory tasted of ash." Carlson stared at his hands. They were steady, trained by months of discipline. Yet he could not shake the image of that radar blip disappearing. He wondered what the pilot's face looked like in the final second. "We're fighting ghosts," he said to no one. Technically, the system had worked. 50 enemy aircraft destroyed, fleet still operational. Strategically, it was triumph. Emotionally, it was collapse. The American fleet had entered a new realm where data replaced danger, until danger reinvented itself as faith. Carlson wrote one line in his notebook. "Technology built us a fortress. They turned their bodies into the key." Evening. The wind dropped. Smoke thinned into mist. On the deck of Iowa, sailors hosed the blood from the steel. It mixed with seawater and ran back into the ocean. No one spoke. From the loudspeaker came a slow announcement. "All fires under control. Resume standard formation." The war machine, indifferent, continued its rhythm. In the days that followed, new intelligence confirmed what had begun. Japan was forming special attack corps across Luzon and Kyushu. More would come. Carlson read the memo and felt nothing. He already knew. He had seen the future on his radar screen. A bright line that ended abruptly every time. That night, he stood alone on deck. The sea shimmered red, reflecting the burning ships miles away. He thought of the Japanese pilot, of Shimakawa, though he never knew his name. Two men separated by language and purpose, yet bound by the same fire. "Hell isn't out there," he whispered. "It's inside us." Official communiques listed the outcome. 600 American casualties, 5 carriers damaged, 49 aircraft lost. Japanese losses, nearly all aircraft expended, 26 pilots confirmed dead. No mention of fear, no mention of courage. Just numbers, neat and clean. Weeks later in Washington, strategists studied the data and concluded, kamikaze attacks are inefficient but psychologically significant. Psychologically significant. Carlson underlined the phrase in a copy of Stars and Stripes. He closed the paper and muttered, "So that's what we call hell now." When the last fires died, the sea turned silver again. Smoke rose straight into the dawn, without wind to carry it. The kamikaze had failed to sink the fleet, but they had succeeded in showing both sides what the war had become, a struggle no longer for territory or victory, but for meaning. Carlson watched the sun rise over the wreckage and wrote his final line for the day. "We built machines to save ourselves. They built faith to destroy us. In the end, both burned." 2 days after the fires of Cape Engaño, the Pacific seemed reborn. Blue again, calm again. But no one aboard Task Force 38 trusted that peace. On the USS Iowa, Carlson leaned over the railing. Oil floated in rainbow slicks, rippling in the sunlight. The sea smelled of rust and smoke. He wrote in his log, "The ocean has gone back to being an ocean. We have not gone back to being men." In the Imperial Naval headquarters, the air was heavy with tobacco and defeat. Admiral Toyota Sumu stood before the map of the Pacific. Every red pin that once marked a carrier had been pulled out, leaving small round holes like wounds that would not close. "We have lost the sea," he said quietly. No one disagreed. The meeting ended without salute, without hope. Outside, winter rain tapped against the windows of a dying empire. At Ulithi Atoll, the wounded of Task Force 38 returned for repair. Franklin, Sante, Belleau Wood, hulls scarred, decks scorched, smoke still rising from vents. On the Franklin, machinist Henry Evans scraped black paint from a gun barrel. He asked his shipmate, "Heard they're training 300 more suicide pilots in Luzon." The other man shrugged. "If they come, we'll shoot. That's what we do." Then after a pause, "Do you still feel anything when you fire?" Evans said nothing. The question stayed unanswered. In a hut near Makinohara Airfield, soldiers found a burned notebook. Only one page could still be read. "We were born to fight. Now we die to prove it. If anyone lives, tell them we were afraid." The author was never identified. It could have been Shimakawa. It could have been any of them. In American headquarters, engineers studied every report. Radar range, fuse timing, target angle, all perfect. And yet ships still burned. Admiral Sherman wrote, "We built a system to destroy machines. We have met men who choose to die." The conclusion unsettled everyone. The answer to suicide was not more accuracy. It was something they could not calculate. December winds swept across the Philippine Sea. Rain hammered steel decks. Inside the CIC, Carlson watched the radar sweep over a field of emptiness. He whispered, "Nothing on scope, but I can still feel them out there." The screen rotated again, green light circling like a heartbeat. He wondered if ghosts could reflect radar. In Tokyo's design bureau, engineer Kurokawa unveiled a small white aircraft with stub wings and a rocket engine. Its name, Oka, Cherry Blossom. An admiral asked, "Chance of survival?" Kurokawa bowed. "None, sir." The admiral nodded once and signed the order. The room was silent except for the scratch of a pen, the sound of hell opening another door. Days later, American sailors recovered bodies drifting in the current. Japanese pilots still strapped to their harnesses, faces oddly peaceful. One body carried a small wooden charm engraved in kanji. Carlson asked a translator what it meant. "It says peace." He turned the charm over in his hand, the salt water blurring the carved letters, and said softly, "Maybe they wanted the same thing." Washington, December 1944. In a high-ceilinged office, a briefing officer announced, "The Imperial Navy has ceased to exist." Applause rippled, polite and thin. Then General Marshall said, "If we cannot break their spirit, we will burn their cities." Strategy shifted that day, from sea to sky, from ships to civilians. The war would no longer be fought against armies, but against endurance itself. In Kyoto, aeronautics professor Hideo Itakawa wrote in his diary, "We send boys into the clouds, not for victory, but to delay defeat. Each day, another piece of our nation turns to ash. Outside, loudspeakers promise glory for the young. But beneath the slogans, the people had already begun to mourn the living." At Leyte, Carlson transferred to the freshly repaired USS Franklin. He stopped keeping a daily journal. When a reporter asked how victory felt, he replied, "It looks like ashes." Another sailor asked if he believed the Japanese would surrender. Carlson said, "No one surrenders when death is sacred." February 1945. A fishing boat drifting near Okinawa spotted wreckage half buried in coral. On a twisted beam, faded characters read, "Ruihei Zuikaku." The fishermen lit incense and bowed. Smoke rose into the windless sky, curling like a memory no current could carry away. 800 souls still rested below, guardians of a dream that had already drowned. After Leyte Gulf, the U.S. Navy convened technical conferences. Charts, graphs, firing curves. Victory reduced to data. One anonymous officer added a note in pencil. "We can measure precision. We cannot measure the human cost." Carlson attended one session, staring at a projector beam slicing through cigarette smoke. When someone praised the perfection of the system, he thought of the bodies in the water. 1951, Tokyo, 7 years after surrender. Robert Carlson, now a civilian engineer, attended a peace conference. His interpreter introduced himself, Kurokawa, designer of the Oka. They looked at each other for a long moment. Kurokawa said, "We both built things we could not control." Carlson nodded. "And we both have to live with them." They shook hands. No words of forgiveness, no bitterness, only fatigue shared across a silent gulf. Today, history remembers Midway, Hiroshima, Okinawa. Few remember Cape Engaño, the day the last Japanese carriers sank, the day technology eclipsed valor, the day war lost its human face. On that vast ocean once divided by fire, imagine two men. One American, leaning on the rail of Iowa, watching the sun set in the west. One Japanese somewhere in memory, facing east. Their gazes never meet, yet they share the same horizon. An understanding that war leaves only drifting souls. Cape Engaño ended Japan's carrier era. The United States became master of the Pacific, but in every survivor's mind, the war never left. Carlson would later say, "We won the world's biggest sea war, but what we conquered was ourselves." He understood that victory and guilt could occupy the same uniform. Robert Carlson died in 1982. Among his belongings was a small notebook. The last page read, "When I switched off the radar, I saw nothing. But I still heard the sea. Maybe it was carrying both sides home. Maybe that's what peace sounds like."